And it's a work session. I am sorry to be punishing everybody like this, but sometimes things just don't go according to plan. And this book, Germs, is just does not go to plan. What I've loved about Audible, I do love about Audible, is the opportunity to sometimes just have the book already read so it can be consumed just with headphones while, other things happen in life, while I'm doing things, you're doing things. And I guess I've always been aware of the possibility that there are maybe some liberties taken with books when they're read, maybe to improve them, to streamline it a little bit, to take out some of the unnecessary parts. And maybe there's an occasional edit because more than what someone wanted to share in retrospect. But this book here, I just reposted the chapter 5 as 280.3, and I think about 40% of the content was not read in the audiobook. Between 35 and 45%. All I know is I have, for a video that was posted, that's about an hour and 20 minutes or so, I have at least 30, 35 minutes, if not more, of having to read text which was not read in the Amazon audiobook. I didn't discover that we were missing that much until that chapter. So now, this morning, I went back. I'm like, okay, let me look at the text for chapter 3, Revelations, and then let's play the audiobook. And this is exercise I did this morning. And sure enough, big, huge chunks are missing. So, all right, so let's go to 107 on the audiobook here.
Revelations. As the world renounced germ weapons, science was shattering the barriers between man and nature. For the first time, biologists learned how to manipulate the instruction books of life that reside inside all living things. It was a breakthrough that gave biological warfare new possibilities. Nature had written the rule books over the eons. Science first glimpsed them in 1953 with the discovery of how DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, governs our heredity. The genetic code turned out to be locked in a double spiral whose structure was shared by everything from microbes to manatees. Surprisingly, the diverse rulebooks shared not only the same alphabet, but the same language. In the early 1970s, scientists took advantage of this commonality to found the field of gene engineering, also known as bioengineering or gene splicing. Now scientists could edit, rewrite, and rearrange life's script, moving a line or a whole chapter from one creature to another. It was biological cut and paste. With growing ease, genes were recombined and rearranged. An early test centered on the firefly. Its gene for bioluminescence was added to a carrot, and lo, a new variety of carrot was produced that glowed in the dark. In the mid-1970s, scientists of a more practical bent spliced the human gene for insulin into bacteria and grew the hybrids in vats. In time, most diabetics came to rely on this mass-produced insulin, which was the first product of what became a multi-billion-dollar industry. Thousands of recombinant projects sought to cure diseases, save lives, and improve human health. The consequences were also profound for the world's militaries. The new biology might produce diseases unknown to modern medicine and for which there were no cures. Superbugs might be made that were more potent, dangerous, and adept. Germs, it seemed, might become the ultimate weapon. Scientists at the forefront of the genetics revolution were among the first to understand its potential for evil. A generation earlier, the physicists who invented the atom bomb devoted themselves to nuclear arms control. Now, biologists with the most intimate knowledge of the new science began searching for ways to contain the destructive power of their discoveries. Joshua Lederberg grew up in New York City, the first son of an Orthodox rabbi. In 1958, at age 33, he won the Nobel Prize for work he began at 20. His research demonstrated that bacteria transferred genes among one another in a sex-like activity. In time, this discovery became central to the new science of gene engineering. Lederberg became a public advocate for the developing field, but also saw its potential for making germ warfare even more dangerous. To be enhancing that technology, he said in an interview, I thought was in the long run suicidal. His discovery of genetic exchanges in bacteria led him to warn about the dangers of antibiotic resistance decades before the issue caught public attention. Lederberg was among the first scientists to talk about cloning as a practical matter. He helped found not only microbial genetics, but the fields of artificial intelligence in computers and the study of the likelihood of extraterrestrial life.
Joshua Lederberg's lifelong war against biological weapons was informed by his personal knowledge of the military and its struggles with infectious disease. In 1943, while still a teenager, he'd won entry into a Navy undergraduate program at Columbia University for future medical officers. In 1944, he advanced to become a medical student at Columbia's College of Physicians and Surgeons. His studies alternated with spells of duty at the United States Naval Hospital at St. Albans on Long Island. In the clinical pathology laboratory there, Lederberg peered through a microscope to examine stool specimens for parasitic ova and blood smears for malaria. The disease had sickened Marines returning from the Guadalcanal campaign. After receiving his doctorate at Yale, he took up a teaching position at the University of Wisconsin, which had played a major role in Fort Detrick's establishment as the nation's center for making germ weapons. A Wisconsin microbiologist named Edwin B. Fred, last name F-R-E-D, had advised Roosevelt's Secretary of War on the need, and Ira Baldwin, another microbiologist at the school, had selected the Detrick site and become its first scientific director. While at Wisconsin, Joshua Lederberg met Leo Szilard, who had helped make the atom bomb in the Second World War and afterward had gone on to the University of Chicago to study biology. Chicago was full of Manhattan Project veterans, Leo Szilard, Enrico Fermi, Edward Teller, debating what to do with the destructive force they had unleashed, some even advocating for world government. Leo Szilard favored treaties to limit nuclear arms. He and Lederberg hit it off, meeting first in biology seminars and then informally. Leo Szilard, Joshua Lederberg said, became my first role model of a public policy scientist.
Building on his earlier research, Lederberg in 1967 began attempting to splice genes. The experiments did not succeed, but Lederberg saw their promise. It might soon be possible, he reasoned, to create new forms of life in the laboratory. These experiments took place at Stanford, the California university that in a few years would become the center of the genetics revolution. During the Vietnam era, as the national revolt against biological warfare was gaining momentum, Lederberg became a columnist for the Washington Post. In an August 1968 article, he wrote that the creation of synthetic genes threatened humanity with the systematic construction of new disease agents and the most perilous genocidal experimentation. He called for curbs on germ warfare, saying, "Time is running out." Lederberg also campaigned in private to end the government's program and informed its leaders of the dangers he foresaw. In March 1969, he wrote Riley Housewright, Fort Detrick's scientific director, to propose issues for an upcoming discussion. Where will it all end? Lederberg asked of biological weapons. Can BW proliferation be controlled? Will BW be adopted as a guerrilla tactic? And what countermeasures are possible? It was an early reference to what would eventually be known as germ terrorism. I am very worried about this, he wrote, but hardly dare mention it for fear of putting an evil idea in someone's head. Later, in 1969, he told the House Foreign Affairs Committee that allowing new strides in germ weaponry is akin to our arranging to make hydrogen bombs available at the supermarket. After Nixon's ban took effect later that year, and Washington began lobbying for a global treaty, Lederberg was asked by the administration to advise the United Nations. In August 1970, he delivered a speech in Geneva to the UN's Committee on Disarmament that was seen decades later as a turning point. Recent advances in science promised an arms race, he warned, whose aim could well become the most efficient means for removing man from the planet. Infestations had wiped out the American chestnut and the European grapevine, he said. Now mankind faced similar dangers, of our own invention. The peril, he said, had provoked my own moral preoccupation with whether my own career will have been labeled a blessing or a curse to the humanity from which I spring. It was a dilemma, he added, that faces my entire generation of biological research scientists and our younger students at this very moment. In 1972, the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention was opened for signature in London, Moscow, and Washington. In time, more than 100 nations embraced the treaty's goal of abolishing biological weapons and declared germ warfare repugnant to the conscience of mankind. At exactly the same moment, civilian scientists were starting the gene revolution in earnest.
I just wanted to add a little bit of narration here. As I said yesterday, the quote from the movie Ben-Hur, a grown man knows the world in which he lives, and at the present, the world is Rome. It's not a statement to give up. It's not a statement to fold. It is a statement of knowing what you can change and what you can't change. And at this moment here, Lederberg is winning his Nobel. Lederberg is coming into his world as a man and a leader in this field of genetics, bacterial genetics, etc., in a world that is defined by weapons of mass destruction. It is a world where science has been hijacked by a pursuit of global governance, where science has been hijacked by mythologies, in a way. And whatever the potential is for the future of biological weapons, the world is Rome, and the world at this point in time is everything is ruled by fear of the end of the world. Everything. It wasn't that way going into World War II, but now it is. So if you want to be at the table, and if you want to have some influence, if you want to be able to reach into the cabin and get your hand on the steering wheel and maybe help the boat not hit the iceberg, you have to realize that the world that you're living in is a world of weapons of mass destruction. So what Lederberg is saying is, I believe, almost a little bit over the top. And now you have to realize the world is Rome. The world is weapons of mass destruction. And if it wasn't for Lederberg being there, repeating these, all life can end fear-mongering, it would have been someone else, and we never would have heard of Joshua Lederberg. I'm trying to appreciate the position that he was put in here. And I did not know that he was actually not mentored, but he actually saw, or at least said he saw, Leo Szilard as a role model. Of course, Leo Szilard was a major force behind the creation of the Salk Institute.
In 1972, the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention was opened for signature in London, Moscow, and Washington. In time, more than 100 nations embraced the treaty's goal of abolishing biological weapons and declared germ warfare repugnant to the conscience of mankind. At exactly the same moment, civilian scientists were starting the gene revolution in earnest. It began over a midnight snack. In late 1972, Stanley N. Cohen, a young colleague of Lederberg's at the Stanford School of Medicine, and Herbert W. Boyer, a biochemist at the University of California at San Francisco, were attending a conference in Hawaii. As the scientists talked in a deli late one night, they realized that by teaming up they might do something that had never been done before: move DNA from one organism into another, creating a new form of life. They wanted to merge the genes of organisms that were wholly unrelated. for example, those of dissimilar germs or maybe even plants and animals. Scientists had already taken a first step, discovering how enzymes could cut loose individual genes from a strand of DNA. Moving a gene from one organism to another was a greater challenge. Cohen and Boyer saw promise in the early experiments that showed how bugs accomplish such transfers in nature. Genes were found to move on tiny rings of DNA that pass freely between bacteria. Lederberg named these rings plasmids. Researchers had also recently figured out how to glue together snippets of DNA, suggesting an intriguing possibility. Perhaps genes snipped from one organism could hitch a ride on a plasmid as it moved into another. In theory, Cohen and Boyer realized genetic engineering might be simple. The two scientists could slice the DNA from one organism, paste it into a plasmid, and move it into an unrelated form of life. Back in California, the two scientists and their colleagues set to work. In months, they succeeded in creating the first recombinant life. They did not invent the basic technology, but their novel way of applying it quickly created a thriving new field. The serious work began in early 1973. Boyer and Cohen's first experiments centered on Escherichia coli, the normally benign microbe of the human intestinal tract. From an unrelated microbe, they cut out a gene that conferred resistance to penicillin and spliced it into E. coli. Subsequent tests showed it had worked. The new microbe was now immune to the drug. In July 1973, they took a bigger step, splicing genes from the South African clawed toad into E. coli. The new germ successfully reproduced, and its progeny had toad genes. To a limited degree, science had merged bacterium and amphibian. Experimentation showed that not only plasmids but also viruses could be modified for the purpose of injecting foreign genes, and that targets could include not only microbes but plant and animal cells. Until the 1973 successes, nobody knew whether genes from one organism would function or even survive in another. Cohen and Boyer showed that they did. Moreover, they demonstrated that crossing the ancient barriers between species, and in time even between plants and animals, was relatively easy. Among the many repercussions was a very practical one. As germs were customized and multiplied, scientists found that their creations could be programmed to make many different kinds of products, such as insulin or other biological compounds. That process is known as gene expression. A germ can divide every half hour. So in a day, one microscopic parent can produce billions of identical offspring. Germs could be turned into vast factories producing a range of products. As the feat was made public, scientists began to worry that the new biology could accidentally release into the environment novel organisms that would wreak havoc. Cohen and Boyer, aware of the danger, had been careful to insert genes that already existed in some populations of natural bacteria or were harmless. But anxiety spread, and scientists called for a temporary global moratorium on such work. At an old chapel overlooking the Pacific, top biologists gathered in February 1975 to hammer out guidelines for research in the nascent field. The youthful leaders were present at the Asilomar Conference Center, as were its elder statesmen, including Lederberg, who was wary of restrictions on peaceful work, fearing they would slow the advance of genetic research. Altogether, there were 90 American and 50 foreign scientists, including some from the Soviet Union. One group of scientists at the meeting warned that the Pentagon might use genetic engineering to make new germs for biological warfare. They called for an international treaty prohibiting gene splicing aimed at making weapons. That suggestion went nowhere. The organizing committee did, however, after considerable debate, win agreement for the most stringent safety precautions. The sticking point was a proposal to prohibit the most dangerous class of experiments, those that involve transplanting genes that are harmful to humans, such as genes that make botulinum toxin. In the end, the motion for a complete ban on such work passed, though 5 scientists cast dissenting votes. The next month, March 1975, the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention went into force, the culmination of 3 years of diplomacy. But the ban was silent on the central issue raised at Asilomar, the military implications of the new biology. The treaty said any kind of research was permitted, as long as its purpose was protective. But defensive research could look a lot like offensive work. And the gene splicing pioneered by Cohen and Boyer added an even more troubling complexity: the power to create superbugs.
If a foe could defeat old vaccines and antidotes with new bugs, military scientists had reason to try the most lethal experiments imaginable. How else could they assess or counter new threats to their nations? The research was akin to manufacture of bulletproof vests, acquiring a new kind of pistol to assess the old fabric.
In the months and years that followed, the moratorium on potentially dangerous experiments ended as governments set up review panels to evaluate whether proposed research was safe. Gene engineering took off, first on college campuses, then in industry, as companies began churning out designer germs that produced human insulin, interferon, and growth hormone.
This paragraph has a big omission. I'm going to read the whole paragraph. In the months and years that followed, the moratorium on potentially dangerous experiments ended as governments set up review panels to evaluate whether proposed research was safe. Gene engineering took off, first on college campuses, then in industry. Lederberg and Cohen, the Stanford colleagues, signed up as consultants to Cedus Corporation in Berkeley, California, which sought to capitalize on gene splicing activities. Soon, Cedus, and that's spelled C-E-T-U-S, and its sister companies were churning out designer germs that produced human insulin, interferon, and growth hormone. As the narrators note, Cedus Corporation is where Kary Mullis discovered PCR, invented PCR, however you would say it. Kary Mullis worked here at Cedus Corporation. It was at Cedus Corporation where Kary Mullis, the inventor of PCR, one day was at one of the exhibits, I guess showcasing his ideas inside the company, and he was approached by Joshua Lederberg. So given the fact that PCR is one of the most contested, one of the most important foundational technologies and things which enabled the entire pandemic, why is it that I believe I'm the only person on the planet right now that's trying to highlight that this technology came from Cedus Corporation, where Kary Mullis worked, and I believe Joshua Lederberg made a decision, perhaps in collaboration with others, to use Kary Mullis, handsome guy, surfer, all-American dude, who is a more than competent scientist, to use him as a way to make the PCR real and disconnect it from all of the intelligence work and diplomacy and all of the other affairs that Joshua Lederberg would have been involved in. This paragraph is so unbelievably stunning when you think of the implications. Continuing on, the new field, Joshua Lederberg wrote in a 1975 article, quote, promises some of the most pervasive benefits for the public health since the discovery and promulgation of antibiotics, unquote.
Nixon resigned the presidency in August 1974. Soon afterward, Democratic leaders, in a newly combative mood and in firm control of the Senate, began investigating the government's recently abandoned efforts to harness pathogens for war. Lengthy hearings were held in the autumn of 1975, led by Senator Frank Church of Idaho, who was intent on exposing wrongdoing in the shadowy world of American intelligence.
Nothing was said of government planning for biological attacks on Cuba or Vietnam, but the hearings and reports disclosed a new chapter of American history that featured Fort Detrick and the Central Intelligence Agency planning assassinations and stockpiling germs to cripple or kill foreign leaders. The partnership, which extended from 1952 to 1970, had no known successes. The investigation revealed a series of amateurish plots, failed hits, and embarrassing errors. For instance, the Eisenhower administration feared a tilt towards Moscow in the newly independent Congo, had planned to kill Patrice Lumumba, a former postal clerk who, in 1960, was elected prime minister. The CIA considered a number of candidate germs, including the virus that causes smallpox. It decided on botulinum toxin, which acted faster and was more reliable, its paralysis of lungs and muscles quickly resulting in the victim's death. The toxin was shipped to Africa, but tight security frustrated CIA agents, and the plan was rendered moot when rebels seized power and killed Lumumba. Another revelation centered on the Kennedy administration, still eager to undo Castro after the Cuban Missile Crisis. It produced a bizarre scheme to paralyze the dictator, who was a diving enthusiast, by giving him diving gear dusted with two pathogens. The wetsuit was to carry a toxic fungus, and the breathing apparatus was to be laced with a bacterium that causes tuberculosis, a potentially fatal illness of coughing and lung hemorrhaging. The plot went awry when an American lawyer gave Castro a wetsuit untreated with the CIA's poison. As congressional investigators dug further, they found that even after Nixon's ban, the CIA had kept a small arsenal of pathogens, germ toxins, and biological poisons that were strong enough to sicken or kill millions of people. Most of the agents were stored at Dietrich, the inventory surprisingly diverse. It included not only relatively large amounts of the anthrax bacillus, but also two types of salmonella, the bug that the Rajneeshis had used in their restaurant attack. Also listed, and I'm going to go over the list here, Bacillus anthracis, or anthrax, 100 grams, Pasteurella tularensis, which is tularemia, 20 grams, Venezuelan equine encephalomyelitis virus, 20 grams. I'm going to read the shortened term, valley fever, 20 grams, brucellosis, 2 to 3 grams, tuberculosis, 3 grams, the salmonella, or food poisoning, 10 grams, a salmonella typhimurium, which is a chlorine-resistant food poisoning of 3 grams, variola virus, or smallpox, 50 grams, staphylococcal enterotoxin, or food poisoning, 10 grams, Clostridium botulinum type A, which is lethal food poisoning, 5 grams, paralytic shellfish poison, 5 grams. Something John O'Loughlin would be interested in. John O'Loughlin should read this book. Someone should tell McDuff to please read this book and start enjoying the benefits of worldly knowledge of Joshua Lederberg, one of the most important people to have extensive knowledge about. Paralytic shellfish poison, 5 grams. Bungarus candidus venom, which is a lethal snake venom, or 2 grams. An intestinal flu, 25 milligrams. And a toxaferine, which is a paralyzer, 100 milligrams.
The senators blasted the spy agency and army biologists for ignoring the president's order. We must insist that these agencies operate strictly within the law, Senator Church said.
Cut that out. Bill Patrick, though never called to testify, was unapologetic about the arsenal. In interviews, he said he had assisted the CIA but seldom knew specifics. He went on to say, quote, "If you were asked to prepare a product that had certain characteristics, you'd know damn well what it was for. But I was never told what it was for. We want this because we want to assassinate somebody. I didn't know that," said Bill Patrick. A CIA document released at a hearing said the characteristics of its stockpile germs included forms, quote, "suitable for dusting of clothes, pillows, etc., which conjured up visions of dictators being killed in bed." Patrick was not alone, it turned out, in developing agents to maim and kill individuals. Such work had long predated his arrival at Fort Detrick. The story of America's only known biological attack came out piecemeal in the hearings and made no headlines, unlike the Church Committee's other disclosures. The first hint emerged on September 16th of 1975, when William E. Colby, then Director of Central Intelligence, told the senators that the poisonous cache had been created partly because a predecessor agency, the Office of Strategic Services, had used such toxins effectively. In fact, William Colby said, the OSS had conducted, quote, "a successful operation using biological warfare materials to incapacitate a Nazi leader temporarily," unquote. He gave no details, and publicly at least, the senators demanded none. Senator Edward M. Kennedy of Massachusetts, He's usually called Ted Kennedy. This is the other uncle of the current HHS Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Senator Edward M. Kennedy of Massachusetts reported at the end of a lengthy follow-up hearing in May of 1977 that some CIA documents had arrived only, quote, a few minutes ago, which disclosed that spies had attacked the still unidentified top Nazi, quote, to prevent his appearance at a major economic conference during the war. They used food poisoning, which was rather successful, unquote. But Senator Kennedy mentioned no toxin and identified no victim. It took a CIA document buried in the back of the hearing record and all but lost publicly to finally do so. Even this report, however, avoided the embarrassing truth. The target of the clandestine attack was Hjalmar Schacht. Hjalmar Schacht was the financial brains of the Third Reich. After Adolf Hitler's rise to power in 1933, Schacht was appointed president of the Reichsbank. Sometime in the early 1940s, OSS agents had obtained the requisite poison and administered it to Schacht, apparently in his food. Technically, the attack was said to be successful. The chosen toxin was from a Staphylococcus bacterium, one of the same poisons used to strike against Cuba. The symptoms that Schacht experienced most likely included chills, headache, muscle pain, coughing, and high fever. Perhaps most important, the assault remained secret. The problem was that Schacht turned out to be an anti-Hitler conspirator, or at least he appeared to be one. When plotters unsuccessfully tried to assassinate Hitler in July of 1944, Schacht was thrown into a concentration camp. American troops found him at Dachau in April of 1945 and released him. The Nuremberg tribunal acquitted him of all war crimes. That is quite a serious 2 pages of omissions from the book.
Hjalmar Schacht was a German economist, banker, center-right politician, and co-founder in 1918 of the German Democratic Party. He served as the currency commissioner and president of the Reichsbank under the Weimar Republic. He was a fierce critic of his country's post-World War I reparations obligations. He served in Adolf Hitler's government as president of the Central Bank 1933-1939 and as Minister of Economics. While Schacht was for a time feted for his role in the German economic miracle, he opposed elements of Hitler's policy of German rearmament insofar as it violated the Treaty of Versailles and disrupted the German economy. His views in this regard led Schacht to clash with Hitler and most notably with Hermann Göring. He resigned as president of the Reichsbank in January 1939. He remained as a minister without portfolio and received the same salary until he left the government in January 1943. In 1944, Schacht was arrested by the Gestapo following the assassination attempt on Hitler on 20 July 1944 because he allegedly had contact with the assassins.
As congressional investigators probed the American germ program, the U.S. intelligence community disagreed on whether the Soviet Union was secretly forging ahead on biological weapons. The disputes began in 1975, the year the Germ Treaty took effect. The time allotted for the destruction of global germ arsenals had been 3 years, the time it took the United States to scrap its own biological weapons. Several government officials wrote a secret paper arguing that the Soviet Union was illegally continuing an offensive program. Their conclusions were dismissed as speculative. At about the same time, a State Department official asserted that the Soviets' new intercontinental missile, the SS-11, was designed to carry a biological warhead. His bosses, one colleague said, found the idea ludicrous. A senior Soviet diplomat stationed at the United Nations defected to the United States in 1978 and warned that his country's military had embarked on a secret biological program, a claim that was viewed as intriguing but unsubstantiated.
Gary Crocker was a believer. A junior analyst at the State Department's intelligence arm, Crocker had been questioning the Soviets' biological intentions since shortly after joining the department in 1974. He, Gary Crocker, had begun his career, as many of his colleagues, studying the Soviet nuclear program. But Crocker had quickly gravitated to the arcane specialty of biological and chemical weapons, known colloquially inside the government as, quote, bugs and gas, unquote. The United States employed thousands of people to follow the twists and turns in Moscow's strategic programs. Phalanxes of experts tracked each new missile and warhead. These glamorous jobs tended to be held by men. The bugs and gas crowd was much smaller and included an unusually large number of women. For much of the 1970s, the group assigned to assess the world's biological and chemical weapons could fit comfortably in a small room. That meant that a single analyst, man or woman, could change a policy if that person's voice could influence the wider bureaucracy. Crocker would spend most of his career representing the State Department at the monthly meetings. He recalled, quote, "We all knew each other and worked together. We were kind of a little clique fighting the big guys, the big powers and nuclear weapons. We were the little crowd coming along and saying, hey, look out. There are chemical and biological weapons, too."
In October 1979, an odd story appeared in a Russian-language newspaper in Frankfurt, West Germany, that regularly carried news from Soviet émigrés. The paper's sketchy report announced what it called a major germ accident. The death toll was put in the thousands. By January 1980, the newspaper had fresh details. The catastrophe had occurred in April 1979. An explosion at a secret military base near the Soviet city of Sverdlovsk had sent a cloud of deadly microbes wafting over a nearby village.
Sverdlovsk is an industrial complex in the Ural Mountains that built tanks, rockets, and other weapons.
An estimated 1,000 people had eventually died from anthrax. The paper said the Soviet military had seized control of the area, covering the contaminated ground with fresh topsoil. The story gained international prominence in February as the Daily Telegraph in London and the Bild Zeitung in Hamburg ran pieces on what they described as a calamity of agonizing deaths, cremated bodies, and widespread decontamination work.
The previous paragraph also said an estimated 1,000 people had eventually died from anthrax, a disease that, without treatment, is usually fatal in 2 weeks.
U.S. intelligence analysts had noticed nothing unusual that previous April. Now they began scouring archives of spy satellite photos and intercepted communications from the weeks at issue. Pictures of the area around Compound 19, a military part of Sverdlovsk, seemed suspicious, showing roadblocks, newly paved streets, and what appeared to be decontamination trucks. A report was uncovered that showed that the Soviet defense minister had visited Sverdlovsk just after the incident was said to have taken place. The signs pointed toward a military accident.
That assessment was plausible. Bacillus anthracis is an ideal biological weapon prized by Soviet and American germ warriors of the 1950s and 1960s for its hardiness and lethality. Lederberg calls it a professional pathogen. The microbe's life cycle begins when livestock graze in a spore-laden pasture. The anthrax bacillus can enter the human body through multiple pathways. It attacks the lungs when people inhale spores flecked off an animal hide. It burrows in the digestive tract of those who eat contaminated meat. Or it can infect the skin when it comes into contact with scrapes or open spores. Anthrax is a very rare disease in modern society, afflicting a handful of wool workers and others exposed to large numbers of animal hides. The disease follows an aggressive course. Bacteria from spores germinating in the lungs produce several toxins that attack human cells. The symptoms are initially benign, a cough and fatigue. Patients often experience a brief recovery, the so-called anthrax honeymoon, as their immune system valiantly fights the disease. The respite is almost always temporary, and it almost invariably follows by collapse of the respiratory system and death. The disease follows a similar pattern in people who eat tainted meat.
The reports about Sverdlovsk came at a moment of deepening tensions between the superpowers. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan the previous December had brought an abrupt end to a decade of détente, and President Jimmy Carter was taking a harder line toward Moscow. In March 1980, his administration privately queried Moscow about the Sverdlovsk incident. The next day, before the Soviets could reply, the State Department announced there were disturbing indications that a biological agent had been released. The issue had become a cudgel in the propaganda wars. Moscow denounced the allegations as an epidemic of anti-Soviet hysteria. The outbreak at Sverdlovsk, it said, was caused by nothing more nefarious than tainted meat. A group of intelligence analysts and outside experts convened by the administration dismissed the Soviet explanation. They reviewed the satellite photos and other evidence and closed ranks around this scenario. A mishap at the Sverdlovsk facility had released a plume of deadly anthrax spores into the wind. Some people had died after inhaling the aerosolized microbes, and others had fallen ill weeks later after eating the meat of infected cattle. The group felt that it needed two etiologies because the epidemic had gone on for 7 weeks. The disease, it concluded, came first by inhalation, then by consumption of stores of infected meat.
The CIA called in Matthew Meselson. The Harvard biologist and proponent of the Nixon ban was eager to see the secret intelligence. He stayed at the home of a CIA official for 10 days. Matthew Meselson said, quote, "I got hooked on this, and I became somewhat skeptical of their explanations." Unquote. If the CIA's hypothesis was correct, Meselson reasoned, one should find anthrax deaths caused by both contaminated air and tainted meat. But the agency said its best medical evidence on the outbreak, secondhand reports from Soviet doctors, described only inhalation cases. Meselson felt the lack of corresponding evidence of intestinal anthrax cast doubt on the veracity of the sources, and thus the CIA's developing theory. Perhaps the agency's informants were unsophisticated. Perhaps they were unable to reliably distinguish between the two forms of the disease and hence between a natural outbreak and one caused by germ weapons.
Around this time, intelligence analysts began piecing together what they viewed as an even more disturbing story of human suffering in a distant part of the world. Hmong refugees from Laos were reporting that helicopters flown by Soviet-backed government forces had sprayed them with a mysterious substance that left horrific burns and lesions on their skin. The refugees called it yellow rain. To investigate, the Army sent a medical team which interviewed 38 Hmong tribesmen in October 1979. The symptoms and accounts the officers reported seemed to suggest attacks by as many as 3 different toxic agents, including one that caused internal bleeding.
If you go to Wikipedia and search for yellow rain, you'll learn that it was a 1981 political incident in which the United States Secretary of State Alexander Haig accused the Soviet Union of supplying T2 mycotoxin to the communist states in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia for use in counterinsurgency warfare. Refugees described many different forms of attacks, including a sticky yellow liquid falling from planes or helicopters, which was dubbed yellow rain. The United States government alleged that over 10,000 people had been killed in attacks using these supposed chemical weapons. The Soviets denied these claims, and an initial United Nations investigation was inconclusive. Now, I also have to mention that, although I'm not an expert on this particular biological weapon or weapon class, I do know somebody, not personally, but know of somebody that is. And that is a woman who's almost exactly the same age as me. Matter of fact, Dr. Rebecca Lynn, middle name Lynn, last name Katz, K-A-T-Z. I affectionately refer to as Rebecca Yellow Rain Katz. Little bit of a play on cats and dogs. This is the PDF. This is actually her college dissertation. Her college dissertation was Yellow Rain Revisited, Lessons Learned from the Investigation of Chemical and Biological Weapons Allegations by Rebecca Lynn Katz. This was her dissertation presented to the faculty of Princeton University for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy. So her philosophy degree, which she has, and now she's a senior person at the Department of Health Law and Law Policy at Georgetown University. I believe she works under, directly or indirectly, for Larry Ghostin, who is probably one of the most prominent co-authors out there of Michael Osterholm, who gave us Living Terrors, What America Needs to Know to Survive the Coming Bioterrorist Catastrophe. You couldn't possibly better predict a large-scale biological terror attack in a major U.S. metropolitan center than this. But anyways, this particular dissertation is one of the most amazing things you'll ever read. So she completed this in May of 2005. And the long story short is that this is one of the most longest and well-written articles you will find defending the United States against the allegations of yellow rain, which is mentioned in this book that most people don't want to talk about, this book Germs by Judith Miller. I wanted to say that usually someone who writes a paper of this nature that actually may have geopolitical significance, they may want to actually talk to some experts on the field. In this one here, I just thought I would list out some of the people that Rebecca Yellow Rain Katz, whose parents are on a very, very close base. She might even be a goddaughter of Anthony Fauci. Her mother has been working for Anthony Fauci for 25 years. Her father was the head of the Red Cross Blood Bank or something like that in New York City. I have a video of him in Congress in the 1980s. So her advisor was Bert Singer, Joint Military Intelligence College, Russ Swenson, Jim Claxton at the Defense Intelligence Agency. She had an internship mentor from the Defense Intelligence Agency, Chuck Hong of the DIA, Michelle Christie of Princeton. Other people include Gary Crocker. Matter of fact, Rebecca Yellow Rain Katz, directly Gary Crocker of the book Germs. Also Kit Green, Chester Maroka, Joe Rosen, Bruno Schieffer, Rod Barton, Al Santoni, the Office of Paul Nelson, Danny Lane, Ed McWilliams, Amos Townsend, Sterling Seagrave, Bill Anderson, Charlene Day, Bernard Wagner, Charles Stahl, Richard Haroof, Bill Kusowicz, Ed Lacey, Andrea Crossland. She's also thankful for Bob McCrate and Joshua Lederberg. This defense paper of the United States definitely didn't do yellow rain. It's all the Ruskies. Even Lederberg helped. This is weird. Seth Karras, Martin Hughes Jones, John Waite, John Bodner, Jonathan Tucker, Matthew Meselson, another name from the book here. Aaron Friedberg, Dan Markey, Eliza Harris. And it just keeps going on. And there's actually a lot more names. And I don't hold it against her. Look, if you have that kind of opportunity, go for it. But Rebecca Yellow Rain Katz, for her Doctor of Philosophy, now she works at Georgetown University and was actually the person who told us, possibly before anyone in the world, that there's someone in the Snohomish County area in January of 2020 who has COVID symptoms and just flew in from Wuhan. That person that told us that was this author, Rebecca Yellow Rain Katz, and her friend Alexandria Phelan, who also works in the same department from Australia. Even in his death, Joshua Lederberg is one hop away from Snohomish County man, even narrative. 12, 13 years later.
Ronald Reagan took office in January 1981, determined to confront what he would eventually call the evil empire. Weeks later, the administration was handed a yellow rain-contaminated plant sample collected by the Thai military near the Cambodian border. A private American laboratory analyzed the material for Washington and reported that the leaf and stem were contaminated with unnaturally high levels of mycotoxins, harshly toxic substances that occur in low concentrations in some crops or can be extracted from fungi. Administration analysts believed the sample advanced the argument that the Soviets were using biological weapons, which was already being built around blood samples and eyewitness testimony. Still, some of the biological and chemical weapons specialists, known colloquially inside the government as bugs and gas experts, urged caution. The results were unconfirmed, and other samples and blood awaited analysis. The tie sample was important, but short of a smoking gun, they warned. Reagan's new Secretary of State, Alexander M. Haig, Jr., pressed ahead. On September 13, 1981, he announced at a conference in West Berlin that the United States had physical evidence that Moscow's surrogates in Southeast Asia were using deadly toxins to wage biological warfare. If true, the charges were stunning, suggesting a blatant violation of the Germ Treaty that went well beyond what might have happened accidentally at Sverdlovsk. Haig's allegations touched off a contentious debate that would echo through the rest of the decade, dividing scientists, government officials, and even America's allies.
Chief among the critics was Messelson, the champion of the Germ Treaty. His high-level security clearances as an Army consultant and stature as a scientist gave him additional clout. Over several years, Messelson and his allies developed an alternate theory that many experts and some government officials found plausible. The yellowish samples from Southeast Asia were actually dried bee feces, not the residue of biological attacks, and the presence of mycotoxins was an illusion, merely a lab error. Messelson began to poke holes in the government's arguments on Sverdlovsk as well. He discovered a witness overlooked by the intelligence agencies, an American professor living in the city on an exchange program, who said nothing unusual had happened in April of 1979. The debate grew harsh. Some Democrats charged that the Reagan administration was manipulating the intelligence to win support for its stance against Moscow and its trillion-dollar military buildup. From the start, Joshua Lederberg was called into the federal clashes over Sverdlovsk and Yellow Rain. In 1978, he had been named president of Rockefeller University in New York City, one of the nation's premier facilities for biomedical research. But eager to reach beyond academia and play a role in Washington, he had joined in 1979 the Defense Science Board, a group of top scientists and industrialists who advised the military. Intelligence officials were eager to hear the Nobel laureate's assessment of Sverdlovsk, but he was agnostic. Joshua Lederberg said, quote, "I couldn't really make up my mind. It looked very, very suspicious, and the Russians were not cooperating to provide access to the kind of information that could clear it up," unquote. Joshua Lederberg thought that there might be a benign explanation, even if Moscow's infected meat story turned out to be a lie. An accidental release of anthrax spores, he said, could have stemmed from an attempt to test defensive equipment. The treaty provides broad latitude for such research. Lederberg said, quote, "There's nothing that says you can't do aerosol experiments with anthrax on a modest scale. If you're trying to test a vaccine against aerosol-induced anthrax, you might have to do experiments in which test animals were exposed," unquote. Lederberg said that his foray into the intelligence world left him unimpressed. He said, quote, "They would pick up any rumor and try to make something of it," unquote. And this is what he said of analysts in the Reagan years.
The arguments over the Soviet germ program were rooted in a clash of cultures between the biologists and the intelligence analysts. Scientists are trained to work solely from empirical evidence, preferably drawn from experiments they can observe and document firsthand. Almost everything else is suspect. We're in the business of being skeptical, Messelson said of scientists. If you've got to have an answer and you're willing to have a 40% chance of being wrong, ask somebody else. Intelligence analysis is as much an art as a science. The evidence, the reports from spies, the snippets of overheard conversations, the photos from satellites hundreds of miles overhead, is inevitably incomplete, sometimes contradictory, and always open to varying interpretations.
The best analysts weave a coherent narrative from the conflicting reports, drawing careful distinctions between what is proven and what is suspected. Some of the arguments are circumstantial. Crocker, for example, gave great weight to the similarity of eyewitness testimonies from Laos, Cambodia, Afghanistan, and Yemen. Primitive tribesmen, separated by thousands of miles, all seem to be describing the same sort of attacks by the Soviets and their allies. The case that the Soviets had continued their biological weapons program was a mosaic, he argued, of which Yellow Rain was but a piece.
The conclusions of intelligence analysts are comparable to grand jury indictments, offering charges, not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They spark debates more often than they settle them. The disputes can rage for years, settled only when intelligence officers recruit a spy or defector who delivers the inside story. The need for human intelligence, HUMINT as it is known, is particularly acute in the study of biological weapons programs, which can be easily hidden within legitimate research establishments. From the outside, research on defenses against germs does not look much different from the development of germ weapons.
Crocker and his colleagues in the secretive world of bugs and gas soon began to gather evidence that the Soviet Union was embarking on a two-track strategy: the production of old-fashioned germ weapons like anthrax, as well as futuristic research into bioengineered pathogens, the very dangers Lederberg had warned of in his speech to the United Nations years earlier. Sverdlovsk, they were sure, was just a glimmer of something much bigger. Their charges set off yet another bitter clash between intelligence analysts and scientists that persisted throughout the decade. The fears of recombinant weapons were deepened by the practical applications of the scientific breakthroughs pioneered by Lederberg and others. In theory, the gene revolution gave any researcher the tools to make bad pathogens worse. But by this time, several companies had produced products in which DNA was manipulated for profit and public health. As companies did for peace, government analysts feared the Soviets might do for war. With the right equipment, military scientists could make a pathogen much hardier or even more lethal. Researchers might use the new techniques to turn harmless germs into killers. Overall, the advances threatened to tip the balance between offense and defense decisively in favor of the attacker. Genetic manipulation made it possible to redesign bugs like anthrax so they could evade vaccines, one of the best protections against a biological weapon. A 1981 paper by the Army's Dugway Center in Utah, titled Recombinant DNA and the Biological Warfare Threat, warned that designer germs could be used to make highly concentrated poisons. A 1983 Army study suggested that bioengineering could turn anthrax into a better weapon for the battlefield by making its spores much more vulnerable to sunlight and natural decay. One of the drawbacks of attacking an enemy with anthrax is that the spores can persist for decades. Growing concern that an enemy might make such a superbug prompted the Reagan administration in 1984 to raise the Pentagon's germ budget so the military could better assess the threat. The gene breakthroughs, officials said, quote, could be applied to the creation of novel biological agents, novel, or to the production of specific agents such as protein toxins, like a spike protein maybe, and quantities that far exceed their natural levels. In April of 1984, the Reagan administration went public with its worries. Its annual assessment of the threat posed by Moscow, titled Soviet Military Power, said the Soviet Union was conducting gene engineering aimed at developing new weapons. Days later, the Wall Street Journal's editorial page began a 9-part series that made bolder accusations. Based largely on interviews with Soviet émigrés and liberally quoting Joshua Lederberg on the dangers of recombinant technology, the series charged that Moscow was pioneering new kinds of evil. Its scientists allegedly had put genes from cobra snakes into otherwise innocent bacteria and viruses, which could then produce deadly venom in a victim's body. The revolutionary techniques of recombinant DNA, the journal said, were being distorted to create a new generation of germ warfare agents. CIA spies pursued the story and heard many of the same allegations, but the agency's senior Soviet specialists found it hard to believe that Moscow was investing huge sums of money into biological weapons. Douglas J. MacEachin, head of the agency's Soviet Analysis Office from March 1984 to March of 1989, was one of the most determined skeptics. A former Marine Corps officer, Macichin found the notion of germ weapons implausible. His idea of war was rifles, artillery, bayonets. He accepted the reality of nuclear weapons and strategic missiles, but the germ threat was science fiction to him. Macichin found the bugs and gas crowd overzealous, drawing firm conclusions from scant evidence. The harder they argued, the less he believed them. Through the Reagan years, Macichin fought a rearguard action against what he termed the evil empirists, analysts, who believed the reforms begun by Mikhail S. Gorbachev would never bring real change. Macichin had no quarrel with the view that Sverdlovsk stemmed from the accidental release of germ weapons. The question was whether the Soviet program had continued into the 1980s. Mieselson and Joshua Lederberg played a significant role in undermining the credibility of the government's bug and gas analysts. Macichin recalled, "We had these esteemed scientists briefing us. On one side stood these Armageddon preachers, and then you've got Matt and Josh, and they're just saying this is all concocted."
As scientists and intelligence analysts hashed out the evidence, the Reagan administration battered the Soviets publicly and privately over germ weapons for much of the 1980s. It was perfect stuff for a propaganda war.
A presidential commission charged in June of 1985 that Moscow was investigating exotic arms that could cause, quote, sudden panic or sleepiness in defending forces, unquote. In 1986, the Defense Intelligence Agency issued an unclassified 28-page report that accused the Soviets of, quote, rapidly incorporating biotechnological developments into their biological weapons program, unquote. Douglas J. Feith, last name Feith, a senior Pentagon official, told the House Intelligence Committee in August of 1986 that Soviet scientists had begun rearranging germs to develop, quote, new means of biological warfare, unquote. The stunning advances, as they said, in the field of biotechnology were inaugurating a new era which designer pathogens could be made in hours, while antidotes like vaccines might take years. The United States filed formal diplomatic protests with Moscow over its germ activities in October of 1984, February 1985, December 1985, August 1986, July 1988, and, I guess again, December 1988. Among the suspected sites were the high-security compounds near Sverdlovsk and Zagorsk, an old town outside Moscow famous for its monastery, religious icons, and fairy tale churches topped by onion domes of blue and gold. The 1980s marked one of the most rapid military buildups in American history. The Pentagon was flush with money for new weapons programs, including billions for development of Star Wars anti-missile weapons. In the area of the budget where a small amount of money went a long way, funds for scientific research on biodefense doubled, reaching a high of $91 million annually. Mid-level officials believed that the United States was moving into an undeclared biological arms race with the Soviet Union, and they pushed America's best researchers to explore the frontiers of biotechnology, hoping to find new technologies that could help them understand the threat of new types of pathogens of war. Several major American scientists contributed to the research, including Stanley Falcow, a Stanford University biologist and member of the National Academy of Scientists, who was later elected president of the American Society of Microbiology. Working on a contract, Falcow and a colleague moved a dangerous gene into Escherichia coli, the common microbe of the human gut, creating a superbug that attacked human cells. The donor pathogen was Yersinia pseudotuberculosis, a less virulent cousin of Yersinia pestis, the microbe that causes plague and, in the 14th century, decimated the population of Europe in the Black Death. Writing guardedly in the unclassified scientific literature, Falcow and his collaborator, Ralph R. Iceberg, that's I-S-B-E-R-G, said in September of 1985 that they named the gene section of Y. pseudotuberculosis that produces its virulence INV for invasion. The germ's aggression, they asserted, quote, can be successfully mimicked, unquote. They said nothing of weapons or war. Instead, they argued that their study could help science understand how infections develop and how to block them. Less openly, military scientists improved ways of transforming benign germs into dangerous ones. At an Army Institute in Washington, D.C., researchers reported that they had developed methods to modify the genetic makeup of normally harmless bacteria such as E. coli to produce any desired level of pathogenicity. The Reagan administration interpreted the 1972 Biological Weapons Treaty as permitting all research with deadly pathogens as long as the intent was peaceful. Richard L. Wagner, that's W-A-G-O-N-E-R, Richard L. Wagner, who was an assistant secretary of defense and one of the program's managers, said, quote, we are doing research in genetic engineering and related disciplines to understand what's possible. But it's for the purpose of understanding how to design a defense, not design an offense, unquote. An analysis of Pentagon research between 1980 and 1986 illustrated the shadowy line between the two. In the name of protecting soldiers and citizens, the American government had paid for 51 projects aimed at making novel pathogens, 32 at boosting toxin production, 23 at defeating vaccines, 14 at inhibiting diagnosis, and 3 at outwitting protective drugs. This research ended doubts about whether the production of recombinant germs was possible. The uncertainty had arisen because scientists in academia and industry, instead of producing waves of superbugs, as some experts at Asilomar had feared, found themselves struggling to keep their designer germs alive. Most man-made bugs turned out to be weaker than their natural rivals. As a result, by the mid-1980s, regulators lifted most curbs on DNA research and approved the release of some bioengineered organisms into the environment. But the military's research demonstrated that what was rare by accident was feasible by design. If superbugs were hard to make accidentally, they could be made deliberately. It was simply a matter of sustained effort, one largely kept secret. The military found it easy to recruit some of the nation's best scientists to work on such challenges, especially when the research extended the frontiers of genetics. But as a rule, top scientists were uninterested in working on mundane preparations for germ defense, the procurement of vaccines, medical treatments, and battlefield detectors. The Reagan administration had funded the Pentagon lavishly, but spending on biological protections was limited. And the military, even when it had the money, found it difficult to buy talent in the fields that lacked scientific allure. On Christmas Eve of 1984, David Huxall, that's Huxsoll, the head of the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, we usually refer to it as USAMRIID, and Richard Spurtzell, a top germ specialist at Fort Detrick, worked late into the night because the Pentagon urgently wanted to know what supplies were needed for germ defense. The two men produced a crash paper that recommended the stockpiling of enough anthrax and botulinum vaccine to inoculate 2 million soldiers against attack.
In 1985, General Maxwell R. Thurman, the Army's Vice Chief of Staff, conducted what the military called a functional area assessment of germ defense. He gathered several dozen top generals and civilians in a room to critique training, doctrine, and equipment. Thurman's report found deficiencies in all three. The military was seriously underprepared. American forces would be, in essence, naked if attacked by a conventional agent like anthrax. A wiry, intense man with a buzz cut and a short temper, Thurman was known affectionately as Mad Max. He was popular, a soldier's soldier. Bill Richardson, a Pentagon civilian with decades of experience in chemical and biological defense, admired Thurman's drive, but felt that his confrontational tactics were doomed to fail. Thurman pushed extremely, too extremely, Richardson recalled. The system grinds on regardless, and vice chiefs come and go. Thurman's report was largely ignored. As the documents circulated, the Army's medical officers asked pharmaceutical manufacturers to submit bids on what it would cost to build the stockpile recommended by Richard Spurzel, a top germ specialist at Fort Detrick, and David Huxall, the head of the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Disease. One company offered to open a new factory that would produce millions of doses of vaccine against anthrax, botulinum, and other agents. The price was high, several $100 million, and Army medical officials could not persuade the Pentagon to make the investment.
Tired of what he saw as the timidity and inaction at Fort Detrick, Bill Patrick quit his Army job in 1986, soon after helping the FBI investigate the Rajneesh assault in Oregon. He was 59 years old at the time, but called himself an old fossil wedded to germ weapons. Sure that the threat was rising, Patrick set up a germ warfare consulting firm that targeted federal agencies and private clients. His business cards bore a skull and crossbones. Atop his stationery was a representation of the Grim Reaper, the Black Sith labeled biological warfare, and the figure's outstretched arms sowing a rain of germs.
One of the key deficiencies of military preparedness identified by Thurman was a lack of vaccines against what Bill Patrick called the oldie moldies, the traditional agents such as anthrax and botulinum. In the late 1980s, a young Army major named Robert Eng decided to do something about the problem. Eng was serving in the office of the Army Surgeon General as the medical defense officer for NBC, nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. Soon after he took the job, he learned that the military had little vaccine stockpiled to protect soldiers against anthrax or botulinum, the two best-known biological agents.
Eng had read the intelligence reports about the biological warfare programs of the Soviet Union and other nations and recognized that if it came to war, military commanders would want adequate supplies of both vaccines.
Eng set out to arrange the purchase of 500,000 doses of vaccine, enough to give 160,000 soldiers the first 3 shots of the 6-shot series. He turned for help to Anna Johnson Weiniger, a civilian Army official with a doctorate in microbiology. Johnson Weiniger understood the destructive power of the anthrax bacillus firsthand. She had specialized in the pathogen while working at Fort Detrick as a researcher before moving to the Army command that handled medical programs. Johnson Weiniger was one of the few people in the United States government to have received the anthrax inoculation, which was developed in the 1950s and licensed by the Food and Drug Administration in 1970. The vaccine was administered in 6 shots spaced out over 18 months. Doctors had little experience with it. In nearly 2 decades, the vaccine had been given only to a small number of technicians and researchers at Fort Detrick and several hundred workers at wool factories. Some of those receiving the shots complained of swelling and other localized reactions after receiving the injections. There were no reports of long-lasting harm.
The Army understood the shortcomings of the anthrax vaccine. A few years earlier, in 1985, it had invited pharmaceutical manufacturers to develop an improved product. The existing formulation, it said, was highly reactogenic, or likely to cause reactions, and, quote, may not be protective against all strains of the anthrax bacillus, unquote. No major drug makers bid on the contract. The disease was rare, the Army's commitment to buying large quantities uncertain.
By this time, America's major pharmaceutical manufacturers were fleeing the vaccine business, driven out by low profits and a rising number of lawsuits. Universal vaccinations for children had vanquished diseases such as whooping cough. But after taking the shots, a handful of patients had suffered severe reactions, including brain damage and death. The scientific evidence tying these cases to immunizations was in dispute, but juries were sympathetic to the young victims and had delivered some staggering judgments against drug manufacturers. By the mid-1980s, shortages of vaccine were emerging. There was a single licensed manufacturer of anthrax vaccine in the United States, an antiquated laboratory operated by the Michigan Department of Public Health in Lansing. Established in 1925, the lab had developed the first diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis vaccine. Some of its buildings dated to the Depression. Others had been built in by the Army during World War II. Officials at the Michigan lab told Johnson Weiniger that they could not possibly meet Eng's goal. The facility had been making small batches of the anthrax vaccine about once every 4 years, yielding between 15,000 and 17,000 doses. On September 29, 1988, the Army signed its first-ever contract to buy large quantities of anthrax vaccine, asking Michigan to produce and store 300,000 doses. Under the contract, the Army agreed to pay for bigger fermenters in which germs are grown for vaccine making. Much of the lab's equipment was more than 20 years old, and as one Army document put it, certainly not state-of-the-art. Recognizing the difficulties of speeding up production, the Army gave Michigan 5 years, until September 1993, to deliver the 300,000 doses. The number of analysts working on bugs and gas had grown rapidly during the Reagan years, and the intelligence agencies began to collect new information about germ weapons and to issue reports on their spread to Third World countries. In June 1988, the analysts reported that Iraq was well on its way to building a bacteriological arsenal under the cover of legitimate scientific research.
The classified study was produced at Fort Detrick by the Armed Forces Medical Intelligence Center. The center had grown in the early 1980s from a single analyst who monitored the world's biological programs to a staff with many different specialists, including a microbiologist with advanced training in genetic engineering. The center's 1988 report on Iraq focused on the oldie moldies mentioned previously.
According to their report, Baghdad scientists had already produced weapons from Clostridium botulinum, which produces a deadly toxin 10,000 times more lethal than nerve gas. It said Iraq was also trying to produce research and development quantities of weapons from anthrax and other deadly microbes. Intelligence reports are often larded with caveats, but this one included several alarming claims. It said Iraqi scientists were developing germs for assassinations, and it reported that Hussein Kamel, President Saddam Hussein's son-in-law and the head of Baghdad's powerful intelligence agency, was personally supervising the biological research. These details, which suggested that the program was supported by the most important elements of the Iraqi dictatorship, were accompanied by a revelation that should have caught the eye of senior American officials. Iraqi scientists were buying their starter germs, the foundation of any biological weapons program, from an American company. According to the report, the Iraqis are very good organizers and excel at purchasing needed offensive supplies using procedures which effectively disguise their intent. They are currently purchasing bacterial strains from the American Type Culture Collection. A scientific supply company then located in the Maryland suburbs of Washington, the American Type Culture Collection was a natural focal point for Iraq's clandestine effort. It housed the world's largest collection of germ strains, including particularly virulent variants of anthrax and botulinum discovered in the mid-1950s as part of the American Germ Warfare Program. The collection served as a global lending library for scientists beginning their own research in the field of microbiology and was considered an important tool in the fight to improve global health. Overseas customers were required to obtain a license from the Commerce Department to export the most virulent strains, but in the 1980s this was largely a formality. Applications from Iraq or anywhere else were seldom denied. In May 1986, the company had sold an assortment of germs to the University of Baghdad, including 3 different types of anthrax, 5 variants of botulinum, and 3 kinds of brucella, which causes an animal disease, brucellosis, that is incapacitating but rarely fatal. Further orders were planned. There seemed little reason to stop them. In the late 1980s, American officials viewed Iraq as more of an ally than a possible foe. For most of the decade, American policy had been to tilt toward Baghdad in its long war with Iran, and the United States even provided the Iraqi army with spy satellite photographs of Iranian troop formations. The American military's contingency plan for the Persian Gulf presumed that American forces would be called upon to defend the region's oil fields against a Soviet thrust into Iran, and that they would join forces with Iraq to fight the Soviet army. American officials had been disturbed by Iraq's use of nerve gas against its Kurdish minority. Nevertheless, the relationship continued. The intelligence report on Iraq's biological efforts went to the State Department, the CIA, and various parts of the military, including the Central Command, which planned and directed American operations in the Middle East. It prompted no action. No one called the American-type culture collection to warn against further sales of germs to Baghdad. No one suggested that the Commerce Department withhold licenses on germ exports bound for Iraq. On September 29, 1988, 3 months after the report was completed, 11 strains of germs, including 4 types of anthrax, were sent from Maryland to Iraq. The order was placed by the Iraqi Ministry of Trade's Technical and Scientific Materials Import Division, or TSMID, which American intelligence officials had already identified as a front for Baghdad's purchases of germ weapons materials. One of the microbes, strain 11966, was a type of anthrax developed by Fort Detrick in 1951 for germ warfare. Belatedly, the intelligence on Iraq prompted American officials to prohibit the transfer of more germs to Baghdad. On February 23, 1989, the Commerce Department banned sales of anthrax and dozens of other pathogens to not only Iraq, but Iran, Libya, and Syria, which were also suspected of trying to develop germ weapons. The ban, said the announcement, grew out of heightened concern about the biological threat. Despite this heightened concern, during the last years of the Reagan administration and the early years of George Bush's presidency, Washington had limited enthusiasm for countering any kind of germ threat.
As the bugs and gas experts worried about new foreign threats, Joshua Lederberg turned his attention to new microbial dangers at home. Weapons were the most dramatic part of the threat, he declared. In fact, human beings were beginning to lose the battle against infectious diseases. The bugs, through the natural processes of genetic mutation and evolutionary selection, were proving increasingly resistant to medicine's arsenal of antibiotics and drugs, as witnessed by rises in AIDS, drug-resistant tuberculosis, and new varieties of E. coli that were dangerous or could even kill. Old diseases once thought to be defeated were showing new strength, and the authorities found themselves poorly equipped to anticipate or manage these new kinds of infections. In 1988, Joshua Lederberg and a small group of virologists and tropical medicine specialists plotted strategy. In May of 1989, they acted. Lederberg told a scientific audience at a 3-day meeting at the Hotel Washington, just down the street from the White House, quote, "Nature isn't benign. The survival of the human species is not a preordained evolutionary program," unquote. Lederberg's warning had broad support among knowledgeable doctors and scientists. The number of Americans who died of infectious diseases was rising rapidly. AIDS alone was a raging epidemic. The meeting was sponsored in part by the federal government's National Institutes of Health, and a follow-up report by the Institute of Medicine concluded that the danger was real. But new money to fight the rise in infectious diseases proved to be extraordinarily hard to attract. In 1951, near the height of germ warfare fears, it had been easy to found the Epidemic Intelligence Service, which trained thousands of disease detectives. But now, however, antibiotics were seen as triumphant. Public health and microbiology had become backwaters, and the billions of federal dollars spent on biology tended to go into research aimed at cancer and the illness of old age, such as heart disease. Public health was messy and old-fashioned. It had a weak constituency and little presence on the public agenda. Trillions of dollars were spent on weapons. For lack of a tiny fraction of that amount, millions of children throughout the world died of infectious diseases each year. Lederberg went on to make little headway.
Despite this heightened concern, during the last years of the Reagan administration and the early years of George Bush's presidency, Washington had limited enthusiasm for countering any kind of germ threat. The Cold War was ending, the propaganda war against Moscow winding down. Independent experts increasingly questioned whether anyone was really building deadly biological arms. The treaty was working, they said. The doubts reached into the ranks of the nation's military officers, most of whom had never liked germ weapons in the first place. Many approved of the ban. By the late 1980s, germ warfare was on the fringes of American military strategy, and the gene revolution just made things worse with its vision of more terrifying agents that could outwit vaccines. When American national security officials weighed the military balance with the Soviets, they worried about conventional weapons, nuclear missiles, and Moscow's huge arsenal of chemical munitions.
The Soviet Union's extensive civil defense preparations against biological attack, including shelters with specially designed air filters, were seen as just another example of Moscow's paranoia. After all, Soviet troops did not conduct exercises in the use of germ weapons.
The problems resulting from a biological attack were too staggering to contemplate. What could a NATO force defending Europe really do if it were doused by anthrax or some other germ? The airplanes, airfields, and gear would all be contaminated. The soldiers would all be dead or gasping for breath. Nothing in the warrior culture of the American military accustomed planners to thinking about battle as a medical competition. General Brent Scowcroft, a retired Air Force officer who had served as National Security Advisor to Presidents Ford and Bush, summed up the prevailing attitude in an interview years later. "I have a bias," he said. "To me, biological weapons are not practical or militarily useful. As terror weapons, they're fine, but in the context of warfare, they're too imprecise, the reaction's too delayed. They're not likely to be employed." The United States military had no real plans for how it might defend itself against a germ threat. "There's an in-box, an out-box, and a too-hard-to-do box," recalled one officer. "We saw it as a threat, but we didn't want to deal with it, to put together a war plan. It was too difficult." The United States also had no plans to protect the civilian population from biological attack. A few specialists, including Bill Patrick and Josh Lederberg, had begun warning that terrorists might try germ weapons. But the Oregon salad bar attack was forgotten, and most senior government officials who thought about the problem at all saw germ weapons as an issue for the military. Why would any group want to unleash an epidemic when explosives could make a similar point without endangering the attackers?
In the late 1980s, skepticism over the germ threat rose as civilian specialists assailed the military's financing of recombinant experiments in the name of biological defense. It was pointless, they charged. Charles Piller, an investigative journalist, and Keith R. Yamamoto, a molecular biologist at the University of California at San Francisco, obtained a stack of documents describing the research through the Freedom of Information Act in 1988 and published it in Gene Wars: Military Control Over the New Genetic Technologies. The authors condemned the burgeoning effort as needless and illusory. Germs, in their natural state, were already horrible enough. Moreover, superbugs could never be turned into viable weapons, they argued, since any country developing them would have to proceed in secrecy and be unable to test them properly. The threat was overstated. Piller and Yamamoto wrote, "Imaginations run wild." Their arguments gained political currency. On May 17, 1989, the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee held a hearing on the Pentagon-financed research. Yamamoto testified, citing new evidence of the military's recombinant DNA research, including development of a type of botulism germ that could evade vaccines. Yamamoto went on to say, quote, "I see no evidence for a biological biotech research race," unquote, referring to possible biological warfare strides by the Soviets. He went on to say, "But if there is one, the United States is far ahead." Senator John Glenn, an Ohio Democrat and the committee's chairman, sent Congress's investigative arm, the General Accounting Office, to review the Pentagon's germ research. The investigators' report, released in December of 1990, questioned the military's choice of projects. American intelligence agencies had a formal process for producing a validated threat list, the list of pathogens believed to be in development around the world as weapons. GAO, or its General Accounting Office, investigators found that 49 of the government-financed projects, totaling $47 million, involved exotic germs not on the list, suggesting that the research lacked a defensive rationale. The report concluded the Army unnecessarily expended funds on research and development efforts that did not address validated threats. Eileen R. Choffness, Choffnes, who is a Glenn aide with a master's degree in genetics and doctorate in toxicology, helped organize the 1989 hearing and subsequent curbs on the new wave of military research. She went on to say, Yamamoto and Pillar were right. It was even worse than they thought. Philip K. Russell, the head of the Army's Medical Research and Development Command at Fort Detrick, was staggered by the GAO report and the Glenn hearings. Russell had ordered studies of the exotic viruses after reading intelligence reports and that said the Soviets were aggressively pursuing them. Putting a new agent on the threat list was a time-consuming, bureaucratic exercise. Russell did not feel he should wait. He went on to say, "We knew the Russians had sent people to Africa trying to collect Ebola and Marburg viruses. That was good enough for us." Narrator's note, you can go to Houstonic.live and search for Philip King Russell, middle name King, and you can read his memorial that was written in the American Journal of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene in May of 2021. It's noteworthy that of the three people who wrote the memorial, one is Donald S. Burke, who went on to be a co-founder of Metabiota along with Nathan Wolfe, and the other is Thomas P. Monath, who had both a West Nile virus vaccine company in the late 1990s, was present at the concerns of a biological terrorism attack in the White House, along with Venter and Podesta and Lederberg and Donna Shalala, with, of course, Bill Clinton in 1998, and worked at Newlink Corporation in the year 2014, where I believe he was the boss of Robert Malone, who was told by Newlink Corporation, by the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, or the DTRA, to hire a contractor named Robert Malone to be responsible for arrange the business details of the sale of an Ebola vaccine from Newlink Corporation to Merck Corporation, which recently hired Julie Gerberding, who was recently hired at the CDC just before September 11th, 2001. Philip King Russell died on January 21st of 2021 at the age of 88. Senator Glenn believed that the Army had veered dangerously close to offensive research. A retired Marine Corps officer, Glenn was no foe of defense spending. He just thought that the United States government had no business toying with superbugs in its laboratories. It was repugnant, even if permitted under a lawyerly interpretation of the treaty. Glenn pressed to restrict funds. Russell was frustrated. He felt certain that the Soviets were making progress on viral weapons, yet the Senate had blocked him from research that could help defenses. Philip King Russell went on to say, "It was a sad set of events, a tragedy. It set our virus programs way back," and he said this years later.
To the public, the case that Moscow was making biological weapons seemed cloudier than ever. Messelson and such allies as Thomas D. Seeley of Yale University had undermined the government's claims on yellow rain, making their arguments in a series of carefully documented articles over several years.
The controversy over yellow rain faded, even though some American officials continued to believe that the Soviets had used unconventional agents in Southeast Asia. Joshua Lederberg remained suspicious. The evidence on mycotoxins was undeniably weak. The government had left itself wide open to ridicule with its flawed science. But he was bothered by the persistent reports that the Soviets and their allies had used germs or chemical weapons. The case, Lederberg felt, remained open.
Questions also remained about Sverdlovsk. The Soviets had repeatedly rebuffed the requests from Messelson and others to allow an independent team to visit the city and investigate the outbreak. But Moscow eventually said it had new studies showing that the deaths were caused by tainted meat. In April 1988, Messelson arranged for 2 Soviet scientists to come to the United States to make their case at public meetings in Cambridge, Baltimore, and Washington. The meetings were polite, with no pointed challenges to the bad meat claim. Messelson said he found the Soviet account completely plausible and consistent with what we know from the literature and other recorded experiences with animal and human anthrax.
I'm adding a narrator's note that the audiobook does not mention Dr. Philip King Russell or Philip K. Russell. It may be because it's a topic that connects too many things to current events, and thus they wish to censor it a bit. Or perhaps, and I totally understand this, it could be just one name too many, making it too difficult to follow the book. But I find Philip King's Russell connection to Monath, Burke, ultimately, indirectly, metabiota, etc. And these are topics that are very, very relevant to, of course, COVID-19. As I'm doing this additional narration, augmentation, if you will, on April 7th of 2025. Continuing on, the previous paragraph talks about potentially needing more investigations inside the Soviet Union. Philip King Russell was unpersuaded and felt that the Soviets had held back crucial evidence, and this is regarding the spread of anthrax. Anthrax contracted from airborne spores can be distinguished from the intestinal variety. A patient infected through the lungs typically suffers severe distinctive damage to the mediastinum, the area between the lungs just below the sternum. The Soviets presented autopsy slides of several people who died in Sverdlovsk, but none showed the key issues. In an article for an arms control journal a few months earlier, Messelson said the American charges about a germ warfare accident at Sverdlovsk were clearly in need of careful and objective review. Further details from the Soviets, he wrote, could eliminate any reasonable doubt that the outbreak was a natural occurrence. At a Senate hearing in May of 1989, Messelson articulated his views before a more influential audience. He went on to say, the burden of the evidence available is that the anthrax outbreak was the result of a failure to keep anthrax-infected animals off the civilian meat market, as the Soviets have maintained, and not the result of an explosion at a biological weapons factory, as previously asserted by the United States. Messelson told the senators that he believed that the germ treaty had been a success around the globe. Today, Messelson said, to the best of my knowledge, no nation possesses a stockpile of biological or toxin weapons.
A few months later, in October 1989, a top Soviet biologist defected to Britain and told a very different story. Vladimir Pasechnik described to interrogators a top-secret world in which tens of thousands of specialists were laboring to perfect and deploy germ weapons. Yes, Pasechnik said, the Soviet Union had produced long-range missiles to deliver germs. He had been the director of the Institute for Ultra-Pure Biological Preparations in Leningrad, one of scores of false fronts scattered throughout the Soviet Union. His institute of 400 scientists, he said, had been doing research on modifying cruise missiles to spread germs. The low-flying robotic craft, which can outwit early warning systems, were adapted to spray clouds of aerosolized pathogens over unsuspecting foes. Pasechnik told his British handlers that his institute had put the discoveries of Cohen and Boyer to lethal use. Plasmids, the tiny rings of DNA crucial for gene engineering, also control a germ's natural defenses against microbial foes.
Never before had Western experts penetrated so deeply into the Soviet germ program, and what they found seemed to go beyond the most hawkish views of the bugs and gas experts. American intelligence analysts had guessed that the Soviets might be working on plague. But Patrick and other experts had dismissed the idea, noting that the United States had never produced an aerosolized plague microbe that could survive outside the laboratory. Pasechnik told British handlers that his institute had succeeded where the Americans failed. It had even created a new, genetically improved version of the Black Death.
Yes, Pasechnik said, the Soviet Union had produced long-range missiles to deliver germs. He had been the director of the Institute for Ultra-Pure Biological Preparations in Leningrad, one of scores of false fronts scattered throughout the Soviet Union. His institute of 400 scientists, he said, had been doing research on modifying cruise missiles to spread germs. The low-flying robotic craft, which can outwit early warning systems, were adapted to spray clouds of aerosolized pathogens over unsuspecting foes. Pasechnik told his British handlers that his institute had put the discoveries of Cohen and Boyer to lethal use. Plasmids, the tiny rings of DNA crucial for gene engineering, also control a germ's natural defenses against microbial foes. The Soviets had tinkered with the plasmids of plague, making the new strain impervious to existing vaccines and antibiotics. It was a disconcerting milestone. Pasechnik's disclosures gave Moscow's work on classical agents and engineered pathogens new importance. Super plague, Pasechnik explained, was no mere laboratory curiosity. The Soviets had packed a dry, powdered form of the germ into bombs, rocket warheads, and artillery shells, and it was only one of many improved agents that the Soviet Union had developed.
Intelligence officers view defectors with suspicion. Such men tend to say what their new masters want to hear. But Pasechnik made an immediate positive impression on the two British experts who debriefed him. One of them, David Kelly, a microbiologist and top British specialist on germ weapons, concluded that Pasechnik was a meticulous witness, careful to distinguish between what he knew from personal experience and what he had heard from others. Kelly said he didn't waffle. When he didn't know, he said so. By this point, Douglas Mackinson, the skeptical CIA analyst, had been assigned to support the Bush administration's diplomatic maneuvering over the Soviet germ program. In early 1990, he learned from a friend in the Directorate of Operations, the agency's clandestine service, that British intelligence was debriefing a highly placed defector from the Soviet germ program. The name was omitted. He said, "Okay. I knew this was going to be a big problem," he recalled. He asked a technical expert on his staff to review earlier studies of the Soviet program, as well as satellite photos and communication intercepts. Nearly everything the mysterious defector said could be independently corroborated. The agencies even sent Joshua Lederberg to London to debrief Pasechnik, government officials said. The biologist who had issued some of the earliest warnings about the new biology reported that the defector appeared to be genuine. Mackinson was now ready to believe that it was possible that the Soviet Union had been maintaining a vast, secret germ weapons program, just as the bugs and gas analysts had been charging for a decade and a half. In February of 1990, Mackinson debriefed the UNGroup, the Bush administration's secret committee for dealing with arms control initiative. He said, "We have extremely credible information from an extremely credible source," adding, "We've gotten tons of corroboration." The group immediately decided to confront the Soviets with the allegations. The charges seemed to be wild, but the group agreed that they had to be resolved. Within a month, the British had raised the issue with Dmitry Yazov, the Soviet defense minister, and he replied, "I know where you're getting this. It's from Pasechnik." A month later, Secretary of State James A. Baker III was in Russia for a meeting with his Soviet counterpart, Eduard Shevardnadze. Mackinson, who was part of the delegation, drafted a summary of the charges that Baker wanted to give Shevardnadze as they went sightseeing. He asked one of Baker's aides where the group was spending the afternoon. "They're visiting the monastery in Zagorsk," he was told. The irony was huge. Right there outside Zagorsk, behind high walls and barbed wire, was where the Soviet Union had set up one of its secret germ facilities. Macechan acknowledged that Pasternik's disclosures had prompted him to see years of evidence in a new light. The zealots, he candidly acknowledged in a recent interview, turned out to have had a point. They were right, he said. There was this program, and it turned out, he added, that the Soviets were investing in it.
American intelligence officials began to look closely at foreign germ efforts, especially those involving the new biology. In June 1990, analysts zeroed in on Iraq's research center at Al-Tuwaitha near Baghdad. The facility employed some of Iraq's best military scientists, and in 1981 had been preemptively bombed by Israel, which suspected it was making fuel for nuclear weapons. Now American experts at the Defense Intelligence Agency studied its buying patterns for advanced supplies and grew to suspect that Al-Tuwaitha was doing molecular biology and genetic engineering for new classes of biological weapons, the same thing Pasternik had warned that the Soviets were doing. This was plausible, the analysts wrote in a report, because the center had produced no publications in these areas. There were, of course, innocent explanations for the purchases, but Al-Tuwaitha's history and its high security precautions worried the analysts. Was Iraq, like the Soviet Union, trying to develop a lethal edge?
Okay, Chapter 3 in the book ends on page 138 of the PDF, which, again, you can download at houstonic.live. You go to the top, you find the little books icon on the menu up on top, and you can find the downloadable PDF there of this book, of the original early September 2001 version of the book. As we're showing here, the chapters in the audiobook do not align with the chapters in the book. So Chapter 2 on the audiobook at minute 37:05 corresponds to the end of Chapter 3 on the book. So we're going to end this episode here. So this episode aligns with Chapter 3 of the book. You may notice the tag down below of the 280 series, and I apologize because of so much additional work being required. It will be difficult to maintain the original episode IDs, so I apologize for any confusion there. The next episode in this series, when we are completing it and have finally re-enumerated it, will correspond to Chapter 4 in the book, titled Saddam, page 139. Thank you very much for joining and for listening. I hope you continue to read the rest of this book. I hope you continue to listen to the rest of this book and take notes. There's so much information in this book, it's at least a year case study. But I appreciate you being here, and I guarantee you, you will be at the tip of the spear in any discussion from everything from the topics of yellow rain to September 11th, 2001, and even COVID-19. By doing the hard work and the discipline of looking at collections of evidence such as this. Thank you very much. See you soon. God bless.